At that moment, the telephone rang. Report from 9001 headquarters. Heavy bombing raids. Boleen looked at Kalman. I believe this is it. It was the morning of July 24th. All units were alerted at once. Telephones were ringing, runners were coming and going. Everybody was waiting for something to happen. Again the telephone rang. Another report from the battle headquarters of 9001 Panzer Grenadier Regiment. Bombs being dropped in front of our lines. American infantry moving back. Moving back? What did that mean? The day passed. There was no attack. The night, too, was quiet. July 25th dawned. At 7 a.m., an advanced company of the 9002 Panzer Grenadier Regiment reported by telephone, American infantry in front of our trenches are abandoning their positions. They are withdrawing everywhere. Soon the same news came from every sector of the division. Looks as if they've got cold feet, Kalman laughed. Perhaps Army is right after all. A few minutes later, 7th Army reaffirmed its view that the enemy offensive would not come at St. Lo. By a line, it was notified that the 2nd Panzer Division was to be taken out of the line to be transferred to positions south of Kar, where 7th Army headquarters expected the enemy to launch his offensive. The place of the relieved armoured division was taken by Lieutenant General Drake Vector's 326th Infantry Division, until then stationed in the Par. The switch was performed without much upheaval. An hour later, at 9:40 a.m., the telephones in the farmhouse at Canny started ringing again. The same report was coming through from all formations in the line, from positions well behind the front, and from every village and hamlet where armoured reserves were stationed. Bombing attacks by endless waves of aircraft, fighter-bomber attacks on bridges and artillery positions. There could be no doubt left. This was it. So it was the Somme front after all. And meanwhile, the 2nd Panzer Division was driving away from the battlefield over to K, where nothing was happening. But why, in that case, had the American infantry been pulled back yesterday and again earlier today? At the time, the move was interpreted as a ruse. Today we know that it had a much more trivial explanation. General Bradley had intended to attack on July 24th. Because of bad weather, he countermanded his order at the last moment. He was afraid the bomb fleet might drop its bombs inaccurately because of poor visibility. However, Bradley's order countermanding the offensive came too late to reach some of the formations. The bombers took off and, as feared, dropped their bombs among their own lines. Panic broke out. The GIs, totally unaccustomed to aerial bombardment, hastily abandoned their positions. That was the withdrawal reported by the 9001st Grenadier Regiment. Even after Bradley had scheduled the offensive for July 25th, some of his regimental commanders, made distrustful by the previous day's events, continued to pull their battalions back from the front line. After all, the weather was not so much better than the day before. These were the withdrawals reported to Boleen by the 9002nd Grenadier Regiment on July 25th. In point of fact, the cautious commanders were proved right. In several places, the American aircraft again dropped their bombs on their own lines. The 47th and 120th Infantry Regiments suffered heavy losses. The 12th Field Artillery Regiment was completely smashed. General McNair, the Inspector of United States Land Forces and a personal friend of Eisenhower, was blown up in his scouting car. Even so, quite a number of bombs were dropped on the German lines. For another hour, Bolini's headquarters maintained telephone and radio contact with the forward formations. In spite of the hail of bombs, then all contact ceased. But the entries made during that hour in the situation map at divisional headquarters spoke volumes. More than 2,000 bombers had turned the sector of the Panzer Lehr and the neighbouring 13th and 15th Parachute Regiments into a corridor of death, 4 miles wide and 2 miles deep. Everything had been churned up. Trenches had been buried, anti-tank gun positions had been wiped out, stores of fuel, ammunition and supplies had been set on fire. That 2,000 bombers were attacking on a front of 4 miles meant that each bomber had only to plough a strip about 10 feet wide. It explained the appearance of the ground at 10 a.m., where but an hour before the Panzer Lehr Division had been positioned with 5,000 men. At least half the division had been put out of action, killed, wounded, buried alive, or driven insane. Tanks and guns in the forward line had been smashed to pulp. The roads were impassable. But that was not yet enough for General Bradley. Safety first was his first principle. At 10 a.m. precisely, he therefore sent in another 400 fighter bombers, which pounced on anything that was still moving. Even that was not enough. At 10:30 a.m., medium bombers made a precision attack on the roads to Sanil and Maran. Only then came the 7th United States Corps Infantry. The 3 infantry divisions were little more than pacemakers to clear and secure the corridor for the motorized units that followed behind. The bombers had done their job thoroughly, too thoroughly. The GIs, with their bulky equipment, were making only slow and laborious progress across the lunar landscape of bomb craters, uprooted trees, wire, and masonry. The tanks at first were not able to move at all. Engineers had to clear a path for them with bulldozers. Bolina rode over to the battle headquarters of the 9,001st Regiment on a motorcycle. Colonel von Hauser was sitting in the basement of an ancient stone tower. A second lieutenant was just running down the stairs into the vaulted room. He had been sent forward to reconnoitre. "Here you can have it first hand," the colonel said to the general, and the general listened to the lieutenant's account. "I did not find a single strong point that was intact. The main fighting line has vanished. Where it used to be is now a zone of death." By noon, the Americans had crossed the S.L. Perrier Road, but on the following day, July 26th, they encountered German resistance at Maran. Heaven knows how some of the positions had managed to survive. The Inferno, at any rate, they were now firing at the Americans. Bradley immediately ordered 400 medium bombers to put down a bomb carpet. Before long, the 2nd United States Armored Division broke through on the right wing and thrust on to Sanil. By the evening it had reached Casey Bynes's headquarters had pulled out just in time. It was a hot, sultry day. Weary, hungry, and dirty, Boline was sitting in his new battle headquarters near Deney, 3 miles farther south, together with his chief of operations and his orderly officer. The sentry reported a German staff car. A general staff officer had been sent by Field Marshal von Kugel, Commander-in-Chief West, looking for the Panzer Lehr. He was greatly relieved at finding the divisional commander in person. Was he bringing help? The answer was no. He was bringing an order. In his spotless uniform with the scarlet stripes down the seam of his trousers, the lieutenant colonel was a little embarrassed as he stood before the general and his officers, who had not shaved or seen a hot meal for several days, let alone had any water to wash in. He could imagine what these men must have gone through, but what was the use? He had an order to deliver. "Hergen," he said. "Hergen, the Field Marshal demands that the line from Sanlo to Perrier be held." There was silence in the room. Kalman was watching Boline. Major Red was staring out of the window. "The line from Sanlo to Perrier is to be held by a line," he repeated. "May I ask with what?" The lieutenant colonel ignored the question. "What I am passing on to you is an order, Herr General," he replied. "You've got to hold out. Not a single man is to leave his position." As if by way of apology, he added, "A battalion of Schutzstaffel Panther tanks will be striking at the American flank to relieve you." Not a single man was to leave his position. Boline stared at the officer. An oppressive silence hung in the air. Somewhere outside, a stable door slammed. The general felt the blood drumming in his temples. The man who had gone through the mill of El Alamein with Rommel and had witnessed the collapse of the German Africa Corps among the sandhills of Tel Musra and in Tunisia, without giving way under the strain, was now at the end of his tether. His hands gripping the edge of the table, he spoke in a low voice, but his words hung heavily in the air. "Out in front, everyone is holding out. Herr Obus Lant, my grenadiers and my engineers and my tank crews, they're all holding their ground. Not a single man is leaving his post, not one. They're lying in their foxholes, mute and silent, for they are dead. Do you understand?" And Boline stepped up quite close to the lieutenant colonel. "You may report to the Field Marshal that the Panzer Lehr Division is annihilated. Only the dead can now hold the line. but I shall stay here if those are my orders." The general staff officer was saved in answer. A terrific crash, like thunder, shook the building. The earth trembled. Cascades of fire leapt up to the sky. The doors were wrenched from their hinges. The windows were shattered, and the big ammunition dump at D had been hit by fighter bombers and was going up. Thousands of mortar shells were swishing and roaring through the air with comet-like trails of fire. A few thousand mines, countless shells, and thousands of tons of small arms ammunition were going up in salvos over the grave of a division. At noon on the following day, July 27th, Bolin and his staff had established a battle headquarters by the whole stream. All that was left of them was half a dozen officers and 14 non-commissioned officers, runners and signallers from the shelter of an old farmhouse. They were trying to collect the scattered remnants of the division. By the late afternoon, however, American tanks had reached the edge of the stream and began to fire at the building. Unfortunately, the windows into the farmyard were barred. The only way out was into the road, which ran alongside the stream and was under observation by the tanks. One by one, the officers and other ranks scuttled out of the door during the brief breaks in the fire, like rabbits chased by the tank shells. They scurried for cover behind trees and in cornfields. Bolin was the last to leave the house, which by then was burning. He stood flattened against the frame of the door, while Major Reed was taking cover behind a tree some 15 yards away. Now Reed was waving his arm. The general bolted out of the door and ran for it. He flung himself down in a potato field. A shell came whining over his face. Pressed into the wet earth, all clear now, up again and on. When dusk fell, he was seen walking down the road to Percy, all alone. This was the commander of the famous Panzer Lehr division, of which Garrion had said only 3 months before, "With this division alone, you will throw the Anglo-Americans back into the sea." And now he was foot-slogging down a French road. At the Furs headquarters, a little flag was taken off the big situation map. The front snapped at about the same time as General Fritz Bolin eventually came up against units of the 2nd Parachute Corps. Another dramatic conversation was taking place at that corps headquarters near St. Viga, 6 miles east of Percy. It, too, illustrated both the situation and the mood at forward headquarters. This time it was General Mindel, commanding the 2nd Parachute Corps, who had a heated exchange with an emissary of Field Marshal von Kugel. The emissary was the Field Marshal's own son, Lieutenant Colonel von Klug, who had been sent to Mindel to find out what the situation was. The son thus became the butt for the corps commander's anger. Mindel was apprehensive. What was Kugel's spy after? Was he bringing more holdout orders and even further demands? Mindel's corps was holding positions on the flank of the American thrust to the south. A reconnaissance unit of his 12th Panzer Geiger Regiment under Captain Gera had arrived at the crossroads of Lysiel Hermann in the nick of time to knock out an armoured spearhead aiming at the divisional headquarters of General C's 352nd Infantry Division, and thus saved the divisional staff from being taken prisoners. Gera set up a hedgehog position, and for 24 hours held the important road to the south against all attacks by American armour. Half a dozen smouldering Shermans lay wrecked outside his position. But what use was heroism at the El Mesnil-Hermann crossroads? It could not close the enormous gap caused by the loss of the Panzer Lehr division, nor could that gap be closed by the battalions of Count Schulenberg's 13th Parachute Regiment, who hung on grimly in the Marin area. Besides, Moy's 2nd Battalion had shrunk from 800 to 100 men. The cracked front needed help of a different kind. To provide such help, the 7th Army Commander, Colonel General of Schaffeltroops Hausjahr, had ordered the 2nd and 116th Panzer Divisions to launch from out of the threatened flank of the 2nd Parachute Corps an attack on a broad front against the rapidly advancing Americans to break through their lines and, if possible, to re-establish contact with the western coast of the peninsula. The 2nd Panzer Division was commanded by General von Litz and the 116th by General Count Schwerin. The overall command of the operation had been given to General of Armoured Troops Freier von Funk. General Mindel had just been informed by Hauer of this plan. Mindel's drive back to his headquarters showed more clearly than anything else the true situation in the area of operations. Along the 9 miles from 7th Army headquarters to his own battle headquarters, the general was chased out of his Volkswagen by fighter bombers about 30 times. 30 times he was forced to dive into the ditch or behind some bank, and in order to facilitate this maneuver, the doors had been taken off the Volkswagen Jeep. Scuttle Car was the name the men had given the vehicle. A journey that used to take 30 minutes required a full 4 hours. This utter helplessness was enough to make a man cry. Under these conditions, they were to launch a tank attack on a broad front the following day. Would the higher commands never learn? It was in this mood that the general found young Kugel waiting for him at his battle headquarters. Mindel's suspicions proved correct. Young Kugel had been sent to convey his father's reminder to hold out. At this, General Mindel exploded, just as General Bolin had exploded 24 hours earlier. "Kindly convey to your father exactly what I'm going to say to you," Mindel began icily. "The time has come when Normandy can no longer be held. It cannot be held because the troops are exhausted. This is the fault mainly of orders to hold out in hopeless positions. But we are still being ordered to hold out even now. The enemy will break through to the west of us and outflank us. And what's going to happen then? Everything is now being staked on those few panzer divisions. But I can tell you already that these 2 divisions with their old methods won't get anywhere. It would have been far better to organize the tanks into a mobile armored defense force, instead of moving them against imaginary objectives, as if this were a tactical exercise on a map. If your father knew what it means to operate against an enemy with a downright fabulous command of the air, then he would know that our only chance of doing anything useful at all is by attacking at night. Tomorrow's tank attack is going to be a failure because it is scheduled on too broad a front and because it isn't going to start until dawn, which means it will take place in daylight. Those tanks are destined to be smashed, and all that's left for the grenadiers to do is to lie down and sacrifice their lives. It's heartbreaking to have to stand by and watch." Mindel was right in every respect, including his prediction that the attempt to strike at the enemy's flank with 2 panzer divisions must end in failure. The enemy was simply far too strong in the air and on the ground. Things happened as they were bound to happen. True, Mindel's parachute corps continued to hold the right flank of the front, but the entire left wing of the 84th Corps was cut off. The Americans swept through to the south between the 2 corps entirely unmolested. If they wheeled round to the coast, the whole of the 84th Corps would be trapped. If they wheeled to the east, Mindel's divisions would be threatened with encirclement. And if they continued southward without being stopped, then they would burst into the wide-open expanse of France and threaten the entire 7th Army. Faced with this situation, Colonel General Hauer decided to order the 84th Corps to break through towards the southeast and link up with the 2nd Parachute Corps. There was no time and no facility left for agreeing with Klug about any operations in support of this move. When a telephone contact was eventually established, it was broken off again after the first few words. Naturally, the withdrawal of the 84th Corps left the west coast of the Cantan Peninsula unprotected. It opened for the Americans the gap of Averness and gave them their chance for a breakout. For this reason, Sitz opposed the plan. He rang through to Army and asked to speak to Hauser personally, but Army insisted on the execution of the move. It feared the loss of the entire corps if the battered units were left behind on the coast. Field Marshal von Kugel countermanded the order and demanded a gradual withdrawal to the south while holding on to the western coast so as to gain time. "Hold on! Hold on!" But the corps' movements towards the southeast had already got underway and could no longer be halted. One cannot help noticing that Field Marshal von Kugel, that shrewd strategist, acted throughout those weeks as a zealous champion of the orders given out by the Führer's headquarters. One wonders why. It may be that against his better judgment he had lost the courage to contradict orders from above, because he sensed that Hitler mistrusted him and suspected him of having sympathized with the conspirators of July 20th. Whatever the reason, the men in the fighting line, who had expected new and revolutionary decisions from the highly respected strategist, decisions that would take the actual situation into account, now lost their faith in Kugel too. After all, the men in the fighting line could see what was going on and how divisions and regiments were melting away like snow under the sun. General Malman experienced the 353rd Infantry Division, which had been saved from encirclement by the 941 Grenadier Regiment on the CEN River on July 28th, was reduced by July 30th to a mere 800 men. Combat groups formed of several divisions, such as the combat group Hindis, had shrunk to barely company strength. The well-tried 6th Parachute Regiment, which has been cropping up in our chronicle of events ever since June 6th, was down to 40 men out of 1,000. That was the situation, and the enemy made the most of it. On the evening of July 28th, packs of American tanks and motorized columns swarmed towards the south, along all roads between the V and the Atlantic coast. There was no cohesive German line left ahead of them. And what about the KH front? Would it not have been possible to withdraw units from there and switch them to Sanlo? The answer is no. The strategy of the Allied Supreme Command was well coordinated. As soon as the American offensive got going at Sanlo, the Canadians attacked at the other end of the line at KH and engaged the Armoured Group West in heavy defensive fighting. The release of any formations was thus impossible. After all, this was the decisive strategic importance of the KH front. To pin down German forces and to draw one panzer division after another while down at Sanlo, the great breakthrough was being prepared, which eventually was to trap the German 7th Army. It was really well done. The strategy of the Allied Supreme Command was the deliberate exploitation of their material superiority in the field. It was an astonishing organizational achievement both before and during the invasion. Science and technology had made an amazing contribution to the creation of that superiority and continued to strengthen it every day. As a result, Eisenhower could afford a great many things which, in the event of defeat, would have been marked down by history as military mistakes. With his fully motorized units, he was able to form centers of gravity rapidly and equally rapidly switch them. Conversely, he was able to contain German counterattacks which produced critical situations. He saved his soldiers the strains and stresses which had gradually become the German troops' daily bread, marching at night and fighting during the day, always being hunted from the air without pause, without relief, and without hope. Officers and troops of the German army who remembered the First World War realized in Normandy that the nature of war had fundamentally changed. Material and sweat had become more important than spirit and blood. Dramatic developments in military history are invariably the result of some unusual decision by a military leader. General Garand's revolutionary tank tactics, with their bold disregard for conventional flak cover, brought about the gigantic victories in the battles of encirclement during the early phases of the war in Russia. Field Marshal R.L. in Africa applied the principles of naval battle to the desert. He feinted, he sent out flanking columns across deserts considered impossible, and he cut off the enemy's frontline troops from the supply bases and their few roads. He defeated the British armies which, though greatly superior to him in number, were fighting along conservative lines until another military leader opposed him with a new principle. Montgomery gave a demonstration of the tactics of attrition, the rich man's war. The battle for France saw the emergence of another revolutionary army leader, not on the German side but on General Eisenhower's, George S. Patton. A tank leader commanding the United States Third Army, he became the real victor in the West. He was a kind of American Guderian, and Rommel rolled into one. At the end of July 1944, he seized the chance of injecting new life into the concept of the armoured blitzkrieg. Patton drove his 8th Corps down through the narrow corridor between the German flanking position and the Atlantic coast. "Drive on," he ordered his unit commanders, and if they asked about flank cover, he would snarl at them, "You worry about your objective, not your flanks." For the Americans, these were bold, almost reckless tactics. The 4th United States Armored Division reached Avranches in the evening of July 30th. On the following day, it took Ponteau and established a bridgehead over the Sélune. Thus, Patton had burst open the door for the breakout into the unconfined expanse of France. The climax of the invasion battle had arrived. Would Patton be able to keep the door open? Everything depended on one road and one bridge, for only a single road with a single bridge led from Avranches over the Sélune into Brittany. To complete the picture, Field Marshal von Kluge had only the remnants of one single division at his disposal for averting the impending disaster. This was the 77th Infantry Division under Colonel Bayer, an experienced commander. The division had suffered heavily in July and had been moved into the area west of Pontoise for rest and replenishment. One could have heard a pin drop at Bacha's battle headquarters when, on the evening of Sunday, July 30th, his chief of operations read out a signal from Kluge. Avranches is to be taken and held at all costs. It is the keystone of our defence. On it hinges the decision in the west. So the decision in the west now hinged on a single bridge, a single road, and the remnants of a single division. Baker was a man of action. He scraped together everything he could lay his hands on, not only his own form of 77th Infantry Division, but also 14 self-propelled guns, some units of the 5th Parachute Division, and such stragglers as turned up at the various rallying points. With this combat group, Bacha, on the morning of July 31st, struck at Pontoise, took the town, and immediately moved on towards Avranches. The grenadiers penetrated into the town, capturing house after house. The self-propelled guns pounded the American strongpoints and kept the American tanks away from the German battalions. There was low cloud and drizzle, not a fighter bomber was in the sky. The battle continued to rage. Things were not going at all badly for Bacha's combat group, but towards noon the weather cleared. It was the same old story. The men of Albert Olg's 1st Battalion, 150th Infantry Regiment, began to glance anxiously up at the sky. They did not have to wait long. Fighter bombers, the cry went up, like vultures. The machines hurled themselves out of the sky, an unending succession of them. Within a short time, in less than an hour, all 14 self-propelled guns had been wrecked. The American tanks, now unobstructed, rumbled forward into the line, scattered the grenadiers, and forced the combat group to fall back towards the south and the west. A demolition party was sent to blow up the Sélune Bridge. Bacha commanded, at least, he was going to deprive the Americans of the only bridge leading out of the bottleneck into Brittany. But that damned bridge seemed to have a charmed life. The first demolition party was shot up, the second ran into an ambush, and all its men were taken prisoners. The bridge remained intact. American tanks were racing over it by the evening of July 31st. They were outside Bacha's battle headquarters. At the last moment, the colonel and his staff slipped away along a sunken lane. General Patton had reached his objective. After 8 weeks of incessant fighting, the Americans had gained the exit from the narrow Cotentin Peninsula. Nothing now stood in their way. In vain, the Luftwaffe tried to hit and destroy the bridge of Pontoise. It attacked by day and night from August 3rd to August 7th, but except for one minor hit, all the bombs went wide. Across that bridge, Patton was whipping on his divisions. The bottleneck, the road from Avranches to Pontoise, became a solid moving mass of tanks and motorized formations. Beefy officers stood at the bridges, their Colts in their fists. "Keep going! Keep going!" they ordered one unit after another into the bottleneck. Fighters and anti-aircraft guns shielded the corridor from the air, and underneath that umbrella flowed an uninterrupted stream of tanks, track-laying and wheeled vehicles, and marching troops. With lordly disregard for all operational plans and safety regulations, Patton ferried through no fewer than 7 divisions within the span of 72 hours, all of them along that single road. It was a total of over 100,000 men and more than 15,000 motor vehicles, a fantastic feat of organisation. This force burst into the wide-open expanse of France and at once fanned out. Patton never hesitated to expose his flanks. He acted in accordance with Guderian's principle. The protection of our flanks is the business of the infantry that is following behind. Our objective is in front. On August 4th, Renfell, the 4th Armoured Division, thrust across the peninsula as far as its southern coast had gone. The strategic objective was the fortress of Brest, nearly 200 miles from Avranches. Patton sent in the 6th Armoured Division. However, it allowed itself to be delayed at Dang, south of St. Malo, by Bacher's combat units, which were threatening the American flank. Patton had the divisional commander summoned to the telephone. Keep going regardless of your flanks until you've reached Brest," he fumed. Another instance of how boldness or caution can decide the outcome of a battle. A precious 24 hours had been lost. The German garrisons of Brest and St. Malo had time to prepare to defend themselves. Rest could no longer be taken by a coup. While Patton's Third Army was racing through Brittany and towards the south, the United States First Army, under Hodges, continued its offensive in an easterly and southeasterly direction in order to widen the corridor of Avranches. General Hodges's 7th Corps took Mortagne with its commander high ground. A pivot had been established for the impending large-scale wheeling of the entire front towards Paris. Unless the door of Avranches is pushed shut again, the German front in France will collapse. General von Scholtitz said to Colonel General Hare, the 7th Army commander, early in August. But the army and army group were quite aware of the magnitude of the disaster. An attempt had to be made at all costs to seal the big gap of Avranches and to cut off Patton's army from its rearward lines of communication. At the Führer's headquarters, too, the danger of the open door of Avranches was by now realized. General Patton's bold maneuver had been watched with dismay and amazement. "Just look at that crazy cowboy general," Hitler grumbled. "Driving down to the south and into Brittany along a single road and over a single bridge with an entire army. He doesn't care about the risk and acts as if he owned the world. It doesn't seem possible." Why then was it possible? If one remembers the triumphs of the once so powerful German army, it really seemed incredible that this American general could now be playing cat and mouse with it in this manner. How was it possible? Surely there were some strong panzer divisions left in France, and were these divisions unable to cut off a bottleneck of 16 to 19 miles? Was the entire campaign in the West to depend on a mere 16 miles? It seemed absurd. Surely this must be the great chance for the German command. Surely this could become the great turning point just when the enemy had banked a little too recklessly and contemptuously on his run of good luck. That, at any rate, was Hitler's idea. It was shared by Colonel General Jodl, Hitler's chief of staff. On August 2nd, General Weyand, the deputy chief of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht staff, arrived at Field Marshal von Kluge's headquarters. He brought with him Hitler's order for Operation LK, a thrust from Mortagne against Avranches. Hitler demanded that of the 9 panzer divisions engaged in Normandy, 8 should be readied for the attack. The Luftwaffe, too, was to throw into the battle all available reserves, including 1,000 fighters. So far, so good. But what about the date? Field Marshal von Kluge wanted to strike at once. Hitler wanted to postpone the launching of the offensive until every tank, every gun, and every aircraft had been rounded up. Kluge telephoned Jodl. "We've got to strike at once. The enemy is getting stronger every day. He's already got an entire army through the Avranches gap." Jodl's reply reflected an astonishingly over-optimistic assessment of the situation. "Don't worry about the Americans who have broken through. The more there are through, the more will be cut off." An answer fit for a history primer. One is reminded of the reply reputedly made by Leonidas, the leader of the Greek troops at Thermopylae, when informed that the Persians' volley of spears and arrows would darken the sun. "So much the better," he said. "Then we'll be fighting in the shade." Field Marshal von Kluge and Colonel General Hare did not share Jodl's optimism. They knew that any further delay would be the death warrant for their army, and they therefore decided to start the offensive during the night of August 6th, 7. The entire hopes of the Western Front rested upon Operation LK. 4 panzer divisions, the 2nd under General von Lutz, the 116th under Count Schimpf, some units of the 1st Schützensturm Battalion under Brigadier von Fürth, and the 2nd Schützensturm Battalion leading, as well as a combat group of the 17th Panzer Grenadier Division under General von Beringer, and the remnants of the Panzer Lehr smashed at St. Lo, made up the offensive force, which was placed under the overall command of 47th Panzer Corps General von Funk. The Corps commander wanted to use the night for the first big armoured thrust. He hoped to cover half the distance to Avranches in darkness. His 120 tanks were ready to advance along a ridge of high ground between the valleys of the Soel and Saluna, these streams, as it were, providing natural flank cover against enemy interference. The 2nd Panzer Division was ordered to move off at 12 a.m. Rankin-Schützen troops equivalent to Major General, but only the right-hand assault group was, in fact, moving. The attack on the left wing was delayed by a bad hold-up. The tanks of the 1st Schützen Panzer Division had not turned up, and on its way to the jumping-off line, the Panzer Regiment had got into a sunken lane a mile and a half long. As bad luck would have it, an enemy fighter bomber, which had been shot down, crashed on top of the leading tank and completely blocked the road, a bad omen. In reverse gear, the tanks had to back out of the lane. The manoeuvre took hours. Not till daybreak was the left-hand assault group ready to move into action. The right-hand group, meanwhile, had raced on ahead with 2 tank battalions, Panzer Grenadiers, and the 304th Panzer Grenadier Regiment. The Panzer Grenadiers and Engineers were riding on top of the tanks. Then they came up against American anti-tank barriers on the roads. A quick burst of shell fire, an attack by Grenadiers on the American outposts, and forward again. The American main fighting line was overrun. At Dove, the 1st Battalion of the Panzer Regiment ran into a mine belt. Major Schneider-Kostal, the regimental commander, was killed by a mine. Engineers cleared the road. On again, Mesnil-Dove fell, but there was an anti-tank gun left by the church well under cover. That damned gun was holding up the entire attack. At last, a 75 mm shell swept it away. On again, Mesnil-Ad fell. The group was within 4 miles of its objective for the day. Once there, half the distance to Avranches would be covered. The armoured spearhead swept on towards the west. Then the day dawned. The left-hand assault group of Lowitz, his Panzer Division, had not started out from its baseline until shortly after 2 a.m. because of the belated arrival of the Schützen Division tanks. It thus lost the element of surprise. Soon it began to get light. True, a haze hung over the ground, and the hills were shrouded in thick mist. Crossroads vanished from sight, but at least the fighter bombers were being kept away from the battlefield. Like spectres, the massive Mark IVs, the sleek Panthers, and formidable Tigers materialized out of the mist in front of the American lines. The 2nd Panzer Grenadier Regiment took the stubbornly defended little town of San Barthelemy by storm. 100 prisoners were taken, but then the tanks of the Schützen Division got stuck in front of a powerful barrier on the main road to Avranches. Strong formations of the 3rd United States Armoured Division refused to be dislodged. Meanwhile, the 2nd Schützen Panzer Division had broken through into Mortagne and overrun the anti-tank gun positions of the 30th United States Division. It was now storming the high ground outside the town, but the heights could not be taken at the first rush, and then the momentum was lost. It became a tough struggle for every foot of ground. On the other wing, on the right flank of the offensive, the 116th Panzer Division ran into an anti-tank position of the Americans who had occupied the area around Perrier on the preceding day. It could not make another yard's progress. Even so, by the time the morning haze lifted, its right-hand assault group was deep inside the Mortagne-Avranches corridor. One more such push, and the bottleneck would be sealed. Whether it could be kept sealed with the weak forces available was another question, but at least the vital artery of Patton's army would be cut. For a while that might produce a sensational turn in the fortunes of war. "Bad weather is what we need, Herr General. Then everything will work out all right," Lietz's chief of operations said to him, but his wish was not granted. The early haze dispersed quickly. August 7th was ushered in with a cloudless sky, and in this sky presently appeared Eisenhower's wonder weapons, fighter bombers, thunderbolt bombers, and rocket fighters, innumerable swarms of them. They pounced on the columns of the 2nd Panzer Division at Loudre, halfway to Avranches. They swept over the roads and drove grenadiers, panzer jiggers, and engineers under cover with uncanny precision. The rocket shells of the Typhoons smashed into their targets. Against this weapon, even the otherwise invincible Tigers of the 1st Panzer Division were helpless. Desperately, the tank crews ducked inside their steel boxes. The grenadiers lay in the fields motionless so as not to become targets. Rarely had the absent Luftwaffe been cursed as much as along this road to Avernez. How could the Luftwaffe be absent from such a vital operation as this? The commanders in the field were asking each other. The troops, in simpler words, asked, if they're not coming out for this, what are they waiting for? And why did they not come out? 7th Army knew, of course, that the offensive could not succeed without air cover against the enemy's fighter bombers. Air General Boos had promised to make 300 fighters available in ceaseless sorties. He had assured Hausseer they would keep the skies clear above the area of operations. Yet not a single German aircraft showed up, not by any means, because Boos had gone back on his word. The flight formations had indeed taken off from their airfields around Paris, but British and American fighters had intercepted them and engaged them in aerial combat immediately above their bases. Not a single unit reached the airspace over the fighting front between Mortain and Avernez with complete impunity. The Allied airmen were able to hunt down the tanks, anti-tank guns and grenadiers of the assault group of the 47th Panzer Corps. Thus, it came about that for the first time in military history, a vigorous and successful land offensive was eventually halted from the air. The German regiments were still defending the ground they had gained, contesting every patch of wood, every farmhouse and every sunken lane, but the offensive had been broken, smashed from the air. Admittedly, General Bradley had to employ his entire 8th Corps against the German combat groups in order to exercise the mortal danger, but exercise it he did. After 48 hours, the German grenadiers reeled back into their jumping-off positions, which they had left so hopefully during the night of August 6th. In the meantime, the British forces had not remained idle. To support the American defensive operations in the Havana-Moran corridor, Montgomery sent in the 2 Canadian corps south of Kay to engage as many German forces as possible. It was the old technique of alternate emphasis. The operation bore the code name Totalize. This suggested that Montgomery intended a major blow. His idea was to break through the German front, press onto Fes, and attack from the rear the German armoured forces aiming at Avernez on August 7th. After nightfall, the Canadian divisions assembled south of C and prepared to move off. Armour and motorised infantry formations were to attack in 6 wedges, west and east of the C-Fet main road, force a breakthrough and take Fet. In the afternoon, towards midnight, the first aerial bombardment of the forward German lines began. Behind this hail of fire, the Canadians moved off with more than 1,000 armoured vehicles. Ahead of them flew over 1,000 flying fortresses, which once more smashed up the positions of the 272nd Grenadier Division and of the 89th Infantry Division, which had only just been brought over from Norway. Then came the tanks. They cleared narrow passages through these narrow passages. Canadian infantry aboard self-propelled carriers roared into the rear of the German positions. They dismounted, fanned out, and attacked the German strongpoints from behind to crack open the 6-mile-wide arc of German positions south of KH. Montgomery threw in everything he had, on the ground and in the air. On the flanks of the front arc, 500 heavy bombers turned the ground into a landscape of huge craters, crater upon crater, with no level ground left anywhere. It was a new cunning device to prevent the tanks of the 12th SS Panzer Division from making relief attacks from the flanks. Smoke and dust hung in the air to add to the inferno. 700 American aircraft made a direct frontal attack on the most forward German strongpoints. They dropped on them a new type of high-explosive bomb. Squadrons of Typhoon fighters with rocket cannon ranged over the hinterland, intercepting all traffic to the front and pinning down anti-tank and 88 mm positions. The 89th Infantry Division, which had been transferred from an idyllic existence in Norway straight into the inferno of the great decisive battle in the west, bore the brunt of the attack. It cracked. Some units panicked, but other sectors of the front stood up to the Canadian attacks until midnight. Things were looking ugly. The British and Canadian assault units were 3 miles inside the German defences. The 4th Canadian and 1st Polish armoured divisions were still being kept in reserve on either side of the K Road. They only had to move, and disaster would be complete. All that was to oppose them were 2 combat groups of the 12th SS Panzer Division with 50 tanks. Kurt Meyer realised the danger. He rallied his forces, and together with Sturmbannführer Waldmüller went forward to get a picture of the situation. Through his binoculars he saw the packed tank columns along the Kafes road. "Great heavens," he said to Waldmüller. "Suppose they move in now." They could not understand why they were not moving in. The reason was simply that their commanders lacked experience and would not risk thrusting past the German strongpoints which were still holding out. Meyer realized that an attack by the enemy's armour must be prevented unless the whole front was to collapse. The only method was defence within the front line, centering on Sintho, combined with an enveloping attack by German armour. Meyer calculated it should be possible to get ready by 12:30 p.m. "Attack at 12:30 p.m., he commanded. Just then things were livening up in the air. Enemy reconnaissance planes were dangerous. Wherever those fellows showed up, bombing raids followed, and an aerial bombardment of his assembly positions in the neighbouring villages was the last thing Meyer wanted. There was only one way out: immediate attack. Once again, Michael Wittmann's Tigers rumbled northward. Great hopes were pinned upon them. The Grenadiers followed. Everything happened the way Meyer had foreseen. The 8th United States Air Force made a carpet bombing attack with several hundred bombers and levelled the villages where the Grenadiers had been stationed a little while before. Meyer's men laughed maliciously. The fireworks display had not hurt them. They took Sintho and established themselves among the ruins. Wittmann's Tigers gave flank cover against enemy tank attacks and themselves wrought havoc among the Canadian armoured companies. The Canadian attacks, launched piecemeal and half-heartedly, time and again fizzled out in the German defensive fire. In vain did General Simons, the commander of the 2 Canadian Corps, try to revive the momentum of his offensive. The attacks of his armada of 600 tanks broke against the wall of Sintho and Wittmann's Tigers. "The front is holding," the communiqué proclaimed. The front was much too grand a term. There was no front. There was only a shell-torn, pitted, ravaged strip of land 6 miles wide, half buried. The last grenadiers and machine-gun sections were lying in their foxholes. Death and destruction had been showered on them by 1,900 bombers and 1,800 fighters. In the afternoon, the Canadians took Briel, which had been stubbornly defended by remnants of the 89th Infantry Division. Without armour-piercing weapons, the rest of the division, which still used horse-drawn transport, was overrun and shot up. The fighting for Sano raged until nightfall. However, with the fall of Bretteville, the defender flank was exposed. Combat Group Waldmüller and Wittmann's tanks therefore broke off contact with the enemy and withdrew to the Leon River. The Tigers were placed in ambush in the forest of Quez. Michael Wittmann, the much-feared tank killer, was no longer with them. He had met his death in action. To salvage Totalize, the offensive that had begun so promisingly, the Canadian commander decided on a bold stroke. He dispatched a mixed assault group with the 28th Tank Regiment to occupy the tactically important Hill 195, a good distance to the south, by a night attack. In this way he would gain control of the strip of ground between the Leon and Lay rivers, and the German defensive positions would find themselves outflanked. The move turned into a dramatic episode. The British assault force lost its way. Instead of Hill 195, it occupied Hill 140, about 4 miles farther to the east, without encountering resistance. But Hill 140 happened to be the defensive position chosen for Waldmüller's combat group after its withdrawal from Sintho. Waldmüller, meanwhile, had been overtaken by the enemy and forced away from his objective. Thus, when Obersturmbannführer Führer Mittel drove up the hill in a scout car to link up with Rankin's SS troops equivalent to Lieutenant Waldmüller, he suddenly found himself under fire from tanks in a clump of trees. Zigzagging wildly, he raced back. Kurt Meyer had watched the incident in astonishment through his binoculars from a neighbouring hill. "What are those tanks doing up there firing? Did Waldmüller mistake Mittel for a Tommy?" But almost at once Mittel's report came through. The Panzer and Hill 140 were occupied not by German forces, but by enemy tanks. Meyer felt a shiver run down his spine. How on earth had enemy tanks gotten to Hill 140, and where was Waldmüller? Mittel was again sent out to reconnoitre. This time he did not return. His vehicle was knocked out, and although he was now on Hill 140, he was there as a prisoner of the Canadians. Max Wehr had also ordered a reconnaissance of the hill. The result was beyond doubt. The hill was being held by strong enemy forces. Their tank guns commanded the Leon Valley, but this valley was the last possible defensive position north of Fête. Moreover, a new formation, Lieutenant General Chill's 85th Infantry Division, was already on its way to take up positions there. Action was imperative. The enemy had to be dislodged from the hill. Meyer assembled 15 Panthers to storm the hill from the east, and a few Tigers to storm it from the west. Artillery and mortars opened up on the target. The Tigers crept up to the hillside under cover of the bushes. Their 88 mm shells crashed into the clumps of trees and undergrowth. Enormous pillars of smoke signalled direct hits. One Sherman after another was blown up or left a smouldering wreck. And now the first Panthers were coming up from the east. Just then, the familiar opponents appeared on the scene, enemy fighter-bombers pouncing down from the sky. Against them, even Tigers and Panthers were helpless. Damn! Cursed Meyer! Damn! Are we going to lose this round as well? But for once, Montgomery's flying artillery ranged itself as an ally on the side of the German ground forces. The fighter-bombers directed their shells not at the Tigers and Panthers, but at the Canadian tanks. In a flash, Max Werner sent his tanks up the hill. There they found a vast tank cemetery. From behind their smouldering wreckage and from foxholes in the ground, the Canadians offered desperate resistance with the help of 2 bicycle companies of the 85th Infantry Division, which had just appeared on the scene as their division's vanguard. The Canadians were being increasingly crowded together, one batch after another. They surrendered. Obersturmbannführer Führer Mittel arrived with 23 Canadians of the 28th Tank Regiment. A little while before, he had been their prisoner. Now they were his. In this war, roles were exchanged very quickly. 47 tanks littered the ground, smouldering on Hill 195. Tanks and grenadiers of Combat Group Albot stood their ground against furious attacks by Canadian Highlanders. On the right wing, Obersturmbannführer Führer Hurdle Brinks hurriedly summoned Panzerjäger Company with its 75 mm Panther guns on self-propelled chassis to repulse the 1st Polish Armoured Division's attempt to strike across the Leon River. The Poles lost 40 tanks in dismay. Montgomery's divisions withdrew towards the north. FES was once more saved. Totalize had been stopped. Utterly exhausted, nearly dropping with fatigue, the men of the 12th SS Panzer Division handed over their positions to the 85th Infantry Division. They were not to know that their magnificent defensive success would prove an expensive victory, a victory that would lead the German command into fatal miscalculations. Since the danger of a British breakthrough towards Fête now seemed to have been averted, Field Marshal von Kluge yielded to pressure from the Führer's headquarters and ordered another offensive towards Averness with a view to closing the bottleneck. After all, it was a dangerous, disastrous gamble. It meant that Kluge was keeping the bulk of Army Group B in an exposed position, which, on operational grounds, it ought to have abandoned long ago. He closed his eyes to the fact that Patton's army was already streaming past Lemmen. He refused to see that the opportunity of encircling and annihilating the German forces was being positively forced upon the Americans. Unless the front line was taken back at once, things happened as they were bound to happen. On August 10th, the 15th United States Corps wheeled left via Allenon to Arrenton into the deep flank of the 7th Army. Thus, with the Canadian thrust to the Leon River, the big pocket in which Kluge's divisions, with their 150,000 men, found themselves was beginning to take shape. Unless they pulled out to the east in a hurry between Argentine and Fes, while the anti-tank positions on the Leon were still holding out, they would meet with disaster. Garrion once defined the task of modern tank armies as follows. The objective of the armoured troops is always the enemy's capital. General Patton was now applying this principle. He was whipping on his divisions towards the Seine and Paris. Simultaneously, he increased his pressure on central France, racing on towards Tours and Orléans. General Wilkes' 7008 Infantry Division, which tried to stem the southward surge of the American motorized divisions, was overrun. New formations, including the well-equipped 9th Panzer Division, were hurriedly brought up from the south of France. Now that it was too late, they were being sent into action one by one. When during the first week of the invasion, if only they had been moved up to the front in time, they might have reversed the course of events. Again, the Oberkommando de Verrat ordered the southern front must be held. The strategic idea was to hold in the south and to strike back towards the west. The German High Command rigidly clung to its plan to launch one more thrust towards Avesnes, close the corridor and cut off the American forces, which by now were well to the south. The operation was to be accomplished by General UK's armoured group, but even that excellent tank commander could not work miracles. In the meantime, what was the situation in the fighting line? For the past 4 weeks, all divisions of the 7th Army had been in action, and action meant heavy fighting during the day and marching at night without respite. Since the beginning of August, none of the units had been receiving regular supplies. Stores had fallen into enemy hands. Whenever a supply column running on its last drop of fuel arrived at a store or fuel dump, it would find it wrecked. Or occupied by the enemy, the result was that the vehicles, in particular the artillery tractors, were no longer getting any fuel. The picture was the same among the armoured units, and in this condition the troops were being ceaselessly harassed and kept on the defensive by a mobile enemy with an abundance of supplies and equipment. On August 12th, it was clear that the second thrust from Meran to Avesnes, ordered by the Oberkommando de Verrat, was no longer possible. All hopes had been abandoned of halting Patton's Third Army and of chopping off the jaws of the pincers, which were beginning to close around the 7th Army. There was only one thing left: get out of the pincers as fast as possible, retreat across the dives. The horse-drawn divisions moved off, and the motorized formations covered the withdrawal. Family men, 2 steps forward. August 13th was a Sunday. The remnants of the Panzer Lehr Division, now only a combat group Panzer Lehr, were in position in the Haile area, northwest of Arenta. The roads were jammed with shot-up horse-drawn transport, and motorized units were worming their way through. A mortar battery took up position on the edge of the village at 9 a.m., precisely when the morning haze had given way to a brilliant summer sky. The fighter bombers appeared. They swept over the road, combed the small patches of wood, and set fire to the farms and barns where grenadiers and gunners had sought shelter. During the day, General Byne and his staff officers were in a slit trench near the edge of an orchard. The farmhouse, which had housed his battle headquarters, was on fire, and a fighter bomber roared up from the road towards the orchard. Barely 30 feet up, it skimmed over the tops of the apple trees and banked. The pilot was peering out of the cockpit. He was looking straight into the slit trench. Byne could see his face. He saw his eyes. The pilot seemed to be laughing and saying, "Just stay put. I'm coming back in a minute." He completed his turn and was back in an instant, stuttering. His cannon sent its 20 mm shells into the trench with a crash. 2 bombs followed. An avalanche of earth and tree branches came down on Byne and his officers. Those who were still alive dug their way out. Not one of them had escaped uninjured. Some 90 miles west of the Haile orchard, over on the Atlantic, another dramatic scene took place. At the same time, in the courtyard of the fortress of San Malo on Hill 26, Colonel Basher was addressing his men. There were 700 of them left. There was no longer enough water or food for all. That was what Barker told them. "Family men, 2 paces forward," he commanded, and he let those who had wives and children at home fall out and march into captivity. For those who remained began the final chapter of the fortress. The Americans battered the strong points and penetrated into the outer defences. Early in the morning of August 15th, the telephone rang in Basha's underground headquarters. Surprised, the colonel picked up the receiver. "This is Major General Mack," a voice said. Basha was speechless. "I am inviting you to surrender. We are already inside your strong points," the American commander continued through an interpreter. Basha replied, "I see no cause for surrender, but I would request you to take over my wounded, who are no longer capable of fighting." Mack agreed. An hour's ceasefire was arranged. The bulkhead doors of the fortifications swung open. American ambulances drove up and took over the German wounded. For 1 hour, humanity prevailed over the war. Then the doors of the galleries on top of Paula Hill were closed once more. The final round began. Towards 2 p.m., the Americans began to use phosphorus shells. The ammunition dump was hit and an explosion followed. Fire broke out. Burning liquid phosphorus set fire to the straw in the troops' dormitories, and since there was no ventilation plant, the galleries were soon filled with smoke and fumes. At that stage, Baker ordered a white flag to be hoisted, and 350 survivors marched off into captivity. Paws Hill had fallen. Over on the other side, 90 miles farther east in the FES area, the remnants of 15 divisions, over 100,000 men, continued to resist annihilation in a vast pocket. "The pocket of Falaise, keep moving, let's get out of the trap," was the order of the day. But that was more easily said than done. There was but a single bridge over the Orne, across which the divisions of the 84th Corps and the 2nd Parachute Corps could escape. Vehicle behind vehicle, nose to tail, endless columns were queuing up on the road to the bridge throughout the night and well into the morning. Whoever got across was saved. Those who were on the western bank when day dawned had to seek what cover they could in the open ground. For during the day, throughout the hours of daylight, enemy fighter bombers, Typhoons, and medium bombers would try to wreck the bridge, that last road to salvation. Apart from a few rather insecure emergency bridges suitable only for infantry, oddly enough, they did not succeed. Where is Field Marshal von Kluge? The date was August 17th. It was to prove a fateful day for the campaign in the West. Hitler had mistrusted Kluge for some time since he had been informed that the Field Marshal had sympathized with the conspirators of July 20th. On August 15th, Kluge had left his headquarters for the front to consult with General Ebach, but failed to arrive at their agreed meeting place. Hours passed. Army Group B sent a signal to all divisional headquarters. "Where is Field Marshal von Kluge?" Later in the evening, Ebach received a signal direct from the Führer's headquarters. "Establish whereabouts of Field Marshal Kluge. Report back every hour." This keen interest did not spring from any solicitude for the Commander-in-Chief's fate. An ugly suspicion was haunting the German High Command at Rastenburg. "Kluge has gone off for secret surrender talks with the enemy," it was whispered. The rumour, however, was totally unfounded. It was merely a product of Hitler's uneasy conscience. In reality, Kluge had gotten caught in an enemy fighter-bomber attack. His car and his 2 wireless transmitters had been shot up. After that, the Field Marshal found himself trapped in the chaotic night traffic on the congested roads. For hours on end, he drifted helplessly in the slow-moving current of a defeated army. Finally, at midnight, after a 12-hour absence from his headquarters, he turned up at Ebach's command post in Nessy. At the Führer's headquarters, however, his story was not believed. Instead, a man who enjoyed a reputation of unconditional loyalty to Hitler, of ruthless severity, tremendous willpower, and fanatical personal courage, was picked up by aircraft from the Russian front and appointed to succeed Kluge. Thus, on August 17th, Field Marshal Walter Model turned up quite unexpectedly at the headquarters of the Army Group with a handwritten note from Hitler and took over the command in the West. As Model came out of the map room after his first conversation with Kluge, he nearly collided with General Bein. "What on earth are you doing here?" Model asked. "I was going to report to Field Marshal von Kluge. The remnants of my division are to be pulled out of the line for arrest, Byne answered. Model's reply reflected the spirit of the merciless war in Russia. My dear Byne, in the east our divisions take their rests in the front line, and that's how things are going to be done here in the future. You will stay with your formations where you are. He saluted and was gone. Presently, Field Marshal von Kluge was gone too. He dispatched a letter to Hitler and departed. He had explained in his letter, "My Führer, when you receive these lines, I shall be no more. I cannot bear the accusation of having brought about the fate of our armies in the West by mistaken measures, and I have no means of defending myself. I am therefore taking the only action I can and shall go where thousands of my companions have preceded me." In a concise military critique, Kluge then outlined the reasons for the failure of the Mortain offensive. Inadequate armour, no antidote to the Allied air monopoly, a German army in the West that was inferior to the Allies, both in numbers and in equipment. In conclusion, Kluge implored Adolf Hitler to end the war. I do not know whether Field Marshal Model, a man of proved ability, can still save the situation. I wish him success with all my heart, but if he does not succeed, and if your anxiously awaited new weapons, especially those of the Luftwaffe, do not prove decisive, then, my Führer, I appeal to you to end the war. The German people have undergone such unspeakable sufferings that it is time to put an end to the horror. Display now the greatness that will be necessary for calling a halt to a war that has become hopeless. Near Metz, Kluge swallowed a phial containing poison. Model was unable to save the situation. He could not avert the fate that was to befall the troops in the Argentan Fete pocket. On the very day that he took over command of the Western Front, the American divisions at Argentan moved off towards the north. The British and Canadians at Fes struck towards the south. The aim was a link-up and the closing of the encirclement in which the remnants of the German divisions had to be wiped out. On August 20th, the encirclement was closed. The south saw fighting of an unexampled savagery. It would continue until the German survivors had been crushed or had surrendered. Only now did the troops receive the orders to throw their arms away and lay down their lives for the Führer. And they fought down the anti-tank guns and crossed the road immediately. German scout cars, self-propelled guns, and trucks broke from every conceivable kind of cover and raced through the gap towards the east. But unfortunately, they smacked into a position held by the 90th United States Division. The Americans, flushed with the certainty of victory, were completely taken by surprise. They put up their hands, but what was one to do with them? Taking them along was impossible. They were disarmed and left where they were. Two energetic officers, Major Bocknick of the 116th Panzer Division and St. Führer Brinkmann of the 12th Schaffler Panzer Division, organized a new combat group on the spot and attempted a further breakout. They widened the gateway to salvation and made the breakout point Army Commander, the most important gap on the eastern edge of the pocket. Panam Mehre had assembled his combat group in a few farm buildings. Towards midnight, together with General Ellel and his Chief of Staff, von Kahn, the leading team moved off at Shambo. They met an armoured column of the 1st Schaffler Panzer Division, which was just then getting ready for attack. Mehre's group joined them, but the enemy anti-tank barrier proved too strong. They fell back, rallied again, and launched another attack. This time they were successful. They swam across the dives on the hillside sloping down to the river. The enemy was established and was firing down at them. The riverbed had become a death trap for the horse-drawn artillery. Dead horses, limbers, guns, and human bodies were scattered along them. That was the scene on the muddy banks of the dives. The group moved on. Canadian infantry was overrun. Meyer, with his 200 men, tore through the enemy positions like a ghostly hunt. The men did not yell. Almost without a sound, they burst from the hedges. The Canadians, in panic, fell back in the face of this assault. It was led by the commander himself, his head in a bloody bandage and his pistol in his fist. Charging alongside him with a machine pistol was Mikhail, a CAC from Dnipropetrovsk, who had accompanied Mehre throughout the campaign. Hubert Mehrer, the divisional chief of operations, ran with a carbine under his arm. Obertorführer Kohn had an old havoc dangling from his neck, crammed full of hand grenades. They leapt over a ditch full of German dead. That was their one thought, out of this inferno. In his account of the breakout, Kurt Meyer says, "When we had got through, we turned and looked back and cursed the men who had senselessly sacrificed 2 German armies. The 2nd Panzer Division, under its wounded commander von LTZ, likewise fought its way out of the pocket with his last 15 tanks and his divisional artillery. Lowitz mounted his attack southeast of S-Lomba at dawn on August 20th. The 304th Panzer Grenadier Regiment and the last of the Panzer Jaggers covered the thrust. The armoured spearhead, the 2nd Panzer Grenadier Regiment, battered their way through S-Lomba and kept the gap towards Trun and Shambo open for a few hours until the rest of the division had passed through. The 116th Panzer Division freed itself from encirclement in savage fighting and got 50 fighting vehicles safely out of the pocket. Meanwhile, Major Hain, the 84th Corps intelligence officer, was stuck with Corporal Voland in the middle of a horse-drawn column outside Shambo. The bridge down in the valley was already in sight when the enemy tanks opened fire on the column. The drivers slewed off the road to the right and left, trying to find cover in some patches of wood. One group found refuge in the old Chateau d'Oie. Hain and Captain Pfeiffer of the 47th Panzer Corps decided to follow the dictates of common sense and conscience. They organised parties to bring in the many wounded who were lying behind hedges, in the fields, in sunken lanes, and near their vehicles. Before long, the chateau and its park had become a major collecting post for the wounded. Lieutenant Tillman, the medical officer of the 988th Infantry Regiment, and Lieutenant D.E.A. Müller, the medical officer of the Hitler Jugend Division, arrived on the scene and took charge. In vain, however, did Hain send out radio signals in clear declaring the chateau a field hospital. In vain were big sheets laid out on the lawns in front of the buildings. British artillery slammed into the turrets and the four courts. At long last, early in the morning of August 21st, American reconnaissance units drove into the courtyard. Hain handed over the wounded to a captain of the 90th United States Division. Outside the chateau, American infantry had taken up position. Men from Texas and Oklahoma curiously eyed the German officer. One of the men was playing a mouth organ. He broke off and called over to the major in German, "No, this one," and more appositely than he realized, he played the old tune, "A Die Liebe Ostine." Hain felt the tears rising to his eyes, but he did not turn his head. General Elfelt and Lieutenant Colonel von Krian had lost contact with Meier's group during the crossing of the river. Until 3 a.m., the general waited for news about the situation at the breakout points, but the only news that reached him was a signal that he had been relieved of his command. It ran, "Relieved. Corps headquarters personnel to assemble north of Montorel. Re-employment in an intercepting line near Amang." Shortly after 3 a.m., General Hillel led a small combat group, which he had organised from stragglers, into an attack towards S-Lomba. Their road was barred by the outposts of an enemy tank battalion. Hillel tried to bypass it along a sunken lane, but too late. A column of the 1st Polish Armoured Division engaged the group and shot it up. Whoever was not killed was taken prisoner. Thus, General Hillel and his staff were left behind in the pocket in the Stalingrad of Normandy. Left behind with him were 40,000 prisoners of war and 10,000 killed. But 50,000 men had fought their way out. General Mindel exclaimed joyfully when he ran into his Chief of Staff and Chief of Operations at Orville towards noon on August 21st. The colonel laughed and saluted, "Present and correct, Hergen." After slipping out of the trap, the officers and men looked like gypsies. Their uniforms were in shreds from the thorn hedges along the sunken roads. The men were covered with dirt, and most of them were wounded. But no one who had survived this breakout would ever again be afraid of anything. "What now?" Hergen asked his corps commander. "I found what's left of 7th Army headquarters personnel this morning. We are to move to the Seine in 2 nightly marches and wait there to be ferried across. The retreat will be covered by an armoured formation of the Schaffler-Panzer Division Das Reich. That's most reassuring, General Blauensteiner said sarcastically. Mindel looked at his chief of staff. He made no reply, and no reply was necessary. Ever since June 7th, the spectre of a big Allied breakthrough had been hovering over the map table at Corps headquarters. At first, Army Group B had lacked the necessary strength to prevent a landing. Then it had not received sufficient reinforcements to split up the enemy's bridgeheads by counterattacks and throw the enemy back into the sea. Costly though they were, the counterattacks of 7th Army had always been only just sufficient to clean up penetrations and patch up the crumbling front. One panzer division after another had been decimated. Protected by their air forces, the Allies had gained enough time to land such vast quantities of men and material that anybody could calculate for himself when this flood was bound to burst through the weak dam. And now the time had come. For 2 months the collapse had been delayed. Now it had taken place. Admittedly, there had been no large-scale surrender in the Fetz pocket. 1/3 of 7th Army had been able to escape and avoid annihilation. But the armoured troops, the backbone of all offensive operations, had been smashed. Their remnants were, at best, suitable for defensive fighting. After Fett, Army Group B disposed of tanks in fighting order, a mere 100 tanks. Mindel recalled the information sheet which had been sent to him from the Führer's headquarters in December 1943. According to shorthand record number 35, page 24, Hitler had confidently and optimistically told a conference on December 20th, 1943. The decisive point is that at the moment of landing, the enemy will have bombs dropping on his head. We shall then compel him to take cover, and so long as there is even a single aircraft in the sky, he must remain under cover. In this way he will lose time hour by hour. Within half a day, however, our reserves will be moving up. If the enemy is pinned down on the beach for only 6 or 8 hours, you can well imagine what this will mean for us. Hitler's calculation had been wrong. True, the enemy had been pinned down upon landing for 6 hours or more, even without the Luftwaffe, but the reserves had never turned up. At first they had been mobilized only in driblets and too late, and then they had been employed wrongly and with insufficient artillery support. They had not been able to move in during the critical first 48 hours after the landing, and the Allies had been able to consolidate their positions. Once the Allies had managed to entrench themselves, the German command had found it impossible to use the reserves for counterattacks of any kind. From mid-July on, the Luftwaffe, having failed in its offensive against the enemy's air forces, was unable to provide the necessary air support. The Allies' threefold superiority in air power, which had been earned in a long and bitter struggle, could not be countered. From now on, the German divisions had to fight at disadvantage on the ground. The Allied air forces had acquired unrestricted control of the skies and were able to destroy German artillery and tank formations without trouble. In the summer of 1944, the Germans were a backward army. The German troops fought with valour, but what did it avail them? Outnumbered, outgunned, and hampered by the absence of supplies, they had to cede an ever-increasing piece of land to their opponents. Only one soldier, one man who had fought and who knew the situation, was really calm at that moment. It was General Mindel. He accepted the situation in a matter-of-fact way. His calm was a huge support to his men. It was the perfect response to the enormous pressure they had been under for so long. Mindel continued to soldier on, even as the enormity of the situation sank in. His resolve and leadership were invaluable to those around him.